Hi, I'm Tracy Oppenheimer for Reason TV, and today we're streaming live from Reason's studio in Los Angeles. Today we're talking with Lisa Snell, Director of Education and Child Welfare Studies at Reason Foundation, the nonprofit that publishes Reason Magazine, Reason.com, and Reason TV. Lisa writes and speaks regularly about education policy and is perhaps best known for spearheading the campaign against universal preschool in California, which voters rejected overwhelmingly in a ballot initiative in 2006. Lisa made the point that forcing all 4-year-olds to attend state-supported preschool was incredibly weak from an educational perspective and potentially devastating from a cost perspective. Lisa holds a master's degree in communication from Cal State, and as the mother of 2 children, education is something she not only takes seriously, but personally. Lisa, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks so much.
So give me the elevator pitch for school choice. Why is it so important for students and their parents to be able to choose among competing K-12 educational options? And what's wrong with traditional publicly funded education based on residence?
So in our life, we take for granted choice in all aspects that are so much less important than the education of our own children. So whether, it's which cell phone you choose or which airline you fly on or even where you buy your school supplies, we think nothing about making choices. And even in the arena of education, we would never think about putting our 2-year-old in a school based on where we live because it's so critical for them to be safe. And then once you get out of K-12 education and higher education, it would be ridiculous to assign people colleges based on their residential assignment. So we really have this kind of weird artifact left over from school finance and how districts grew up, where for this K through 12, 5 through 17 or 18, we're going to assign schools based on residential assignment and you won't have a choice in that. But I think that's really changing. We just got done with National School Choice Week, where there was 3,600 events around the country celebrating school choice. And the school choice movement is really growing with lots of really cool options.
Yeah, and can you map out a few more of the details of what the school choice landscape looks like today? I mean, how many kids are in choice schools and what forms are these schools taking?
Right. So, I think within traditional school districts and in charter schools and private school choice programs, there's been a huge change in attitude about the expectation that you'll have more say over where your kids go to school. And we actually now have 6,000 charter schools. And basically what a charter school is it's a school that's started by, an individual group of people, whether it's a nonprofit, and they have a contract with the school district or the state or some governing body where they can run their school. But the big difference is they're open enrollment schools. So the kids, they don't get funded if the kids don't show up. And they also have a lot of autonomy from the regular rules and restrictions that regular traditional district schools live under. So in some communities, we have a huge amount of market share. Here in Los Angeles, the LA Unified School District has lost close to 200,000 kids in the last 5 years to charter schools. And in fact, just this last year in 2012, they had more than 40 of their traditional public schools actually chose to convert to charter schools in Los Angeles. And they had to get 50% of their teachers to agree to become a charter school in order to do that. And then private school choice has really taken off as well. It used to be that Cleveland and Milwaukee were the only 2 places you could find school vouchers in the United States. And now we have about 39 school choice programs that are either school voucher, tax credit, or education savings accounts. And so we have the first examples where statewide programs for school vouchers, and actually Indiana has a large school voucher program that impacts almost every kid in the state. And more recently, Governor Jindal in Louisiana has actually developed a statewide voucher program.
And going back to LA, since we're in LA, could you put the 200,000 number in perspective? What kind of percentage is that?
Right. So it's probably around 20% of LA students at this point. And so Los Angeles Unified has always been the second largest school district after New York in the country. And so for years they had between 800,000 and 900,000 kids. And so they're down closer to 600,000 students now. And obviously some of that is demographic change, but the largest explanation for why so many kids have left the school district is there's now about 150 charter schools that have grown up around LA Unified. And so they had this huge building program in Los Angeles where they've spent almost $20 billion, the largest public works construction program actually in the country. And they argued that they were overcrowded and at capacity. And so what you see now is they've actually built all of these new schools, and LA Unified has all these schools that are under capacity because of the competition from charter schools.
Great. And I mean, what are some of the other big trends in school choice? I know one of your mantras is let the money follow the child.
Right.
And which of these have been successful and which of them have been not so successful?
Right. I mean, I think the interesting thing is that there is a change in starting to think about the price of a student and the cost, instead of just, you know, having districts get per pupil funding and they spend money on staffing and it's completely disconnected from the student. Mm-hmm. Because of charter schools and these voucher programs, people have been much more familiar the way that we fund higher education, whether it's a Pell Grant or a student loan. You know, they get paid based on a student enrolling who pays tuition. And private schools get tuition based on the kids that enroll. But in the public space, it's really been a disconnect between the money and the kids. And so I think that's really starting to change, is that we're starting to think about, and especially because of the digital revolution, and we're kind of moving into, so an interesting program in Louisiana is called course choice. And so Governor Jindal, New Orleans has almost 80% of kids or higher in charter schools. Right. And then they have a statewide voucher program where kids can go to private schools or public schools. And so the governor, the next thing that he decided to do was to go one step further, where not only will we have a voucher attached to kids, but we should be able to have multiple providers. So if you want to take a physics course from this provider and you want to do physical education at karate class, and you know that you should actually be able to fund the student down to the incremental level of the course choice, not just one voucher that would go to one provider. So we're actually starting to see trends, and Arizona has a similar program called education savings accounts, where the parents actually don't have to take a voucher to one school. Mm-hmm. They would actually get the value of the per pupil dollars, and then they would put that in a savings account similar to like a medical savings account. And then they could use that money for any kind of educational services that they wanted to get for their kid. So, you know, if they needed a speech therapist, or they wanted to have, you know, some kind of special science camp that they sent their kid to.
Well, that kind of thing sounds expensive, but in reality it would be driving costs down as a whole, right?
Right. So it's interesting, I was talking the other day to this guy from the Broad Foundation who does a lot of investment in education, and he was talking about New Jersey and Newark, right? The kids are funded at $27,000 a kid per year. And if you just didn't have those kids go to school and you put that $27,000 into an investment account every year and let it compound, when they were 18, they would be set for life financially. I mean, we are already spending like a huge, huge amount of money on these kids, and we can't see what the value is that we get for that money.
And you brought up Louisiana, New Orleans, and yeah, they do have a lot of programs, and they've gotten praise, but they've also gotten criticism. So can you talk about this and whether it can and still would be a good model for other parts of the country to replicate?
Right. So if we start with describing what's happened in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, basically the public school system was wiped out, and the traditional schools were disbanded, and the unions, the contract was null and void. And so they really had a chance to have a fresh start. And so in New Orleans, almost 100% of the kids will be going, they all go to choice-based schools, and 80% of them are independent operators that have schools. And so in the last 5 years, New Orleans has seen a tremendous amount of growth in student achievement, graduation rates, parental satisfaction. And that's the thing, is there's both quantitative and qualitative measures that we care about. I mean, obviously we want to know that we're getting some kind of basic performance in terms of student achievement for the money we're spending. But then the other thing is that because of the tragedy of the commons, so many public schools don't even do fundamental things like clean bathrooms, food that's edible, safety for the children. And it's harder to quantify those things in places like New Orleans, but that's one of the big indicators is the parents are happy and satisfied because the kids are in clean, positive environments where they're safe. And, so the critics, say the best that they can do is say, oh, these claims are exaggerated. Things aren't as good as they say they are. But clearly on multiple indicators, everything has moved in a positive direction. And the other thing is other districts. So Jefferson Parish, which is close by New Orleans, has actually started copying and opening up their lower performing schools to charter schools. And they implemented a money follow the child school finance system. So, I think there's a new book out by this guy called Andy Smerick, where he basically makes the argument that the school district should be disbanded and that we should have contractual relationships with individual schools or groups of schools, and that's really where schools are moving because we can hold them accountable when we do that.
Great. And for the actual curricula, is education, how education is being taught, being changed with the charter schools and other forms of choice schools? Or is it just moving the kids to a better facility and taking conventional education and just improving it?
Right. So, it's both. At the one hand, there's a lot of change kind of just at the margins where, in a lot of cases, these schools are traditional college prep. They say that their mission is to make kids more prepared for college, and they still are teaching the same curriculum, the same kind of standardized. It's not that the schools look revolutionary, but they do things so much better in that there's more communication between the teachers. It may be something as simple as changing the scheduling so that a math and science teacher only has, instead of having 5 groups of 25 different kids, they have a class of 30 kids for math and science and 30 kids for math and science, and they stay with those kids through the day. The problem is that education is so centralized that even simple tweaks on the margin you can't do in a school district. So on the one hand, charter schools just have a lot of freedom to do kind of common sense changes that we would all expect and to really monitor their performance. And so their relationships with teachers are much different. So in most districts, teachers are assigned schools in the same way that kids are assigned to schools. It's based on seniority or where there's a need, and there's not, the principal may not have even the chance to interview the teacher to see if they're a good fit for the school. So on the front end, it's kind of a mutual relationship where I'm a teacher and you interview me, and I want to work at your school, and we're all on the same team to make this school better. And so there is kind of a different personnel relationship and an ownership of the outcomes for the kids, because everyone is there through voluntary association, and that's a positive thing. And so I think that explains a lot of the difference right there. And then the other thing is you are starting to see more and more experimentation in charter schools, where they actually do say, okay, I want to have a niche curriculum where I'm going to have, a tag-along immersion school where kids, learn to all of their lessons in 2 different languages. And if that works for the kids and the parents, that's great. Or we're going to focus on STEM and math and science and technology, and that's going to be the focus of our school. And, I think one of the things that's different is that they can spend so much more time experimenting and measuring the results without having to spend so much time being accountable for paperwork.
And I know that charter schools do boast better results, but I'm wondering, critics might think that because charter schools are skimming the top of the class anyway, what's saying that it's not just those kids who would be doing better anyway, and what happens to the kids who are left behind?
So, there's been a lot of focus on the demographics of charter schools, and a large number of these high-performing charter schools, so for example here in Los Angeles, they have the exact same demographics as the traditional public schools because most charter schools are oversubscribed, and that means they have waiting lists. And so that means they truly have random assignment when it comes to who gets into their charter school because they have to hold lotteries, and lots of kids don't get in, but they're the same large population of kids that want to go to that school. And so I'm not saying that there's never been a case of a charter school skimming. Obviously, I'm sure there has been. But in general, these charter schools that are high performing are serving a very similar population. And in many cases, they serve kids that have been ill served by the traditional public schools. And they actually may be at an even lower quartile in terms of reading and math achievement and things like that when they start out in the charter school, because they've left the traditional public school because they aren't learning these kind of basic student achievement areas. So take Eva Moskowitz is a very outspoken charter school proponent in New York. And she has a group of schools called Success Academy. And one of the interesting features about her school is they actually share a traditional public school with a group of kids that go to the traditional public school. And the kids in the charter school are far outscoring the kids in the same classrooms in the same buildings in the traditional public school. And would you think that those teachers or administrators would ever walk across the hall? You're getting 20 points higher. Is there something that you're doing different than us? And that's the thing, is education, they're so siloed and unwilling to learn from some of these best practices that these other schools are doing.
Why do you think that is? Is it teachers' unions?
I mean, I think that the only way that you can incentivize people to improve their behavior is if there is some kind of change when they do badly. So, if I don't do my job, I lose my job. But in most traditional public schools, so take Los Angeles again for an example, a school that's at 40% capacity now because most of their student body has gone to a charter school or another choice in Los Angeles, still has a fully funded teachers, curriculum facility, and they've seen really no change on the ground because they've lost so many kids or because they're low scoring. So until the money actually follows the child, and so a bunch of urban districts have tried this now. So let's take Baltimore, for example, because I think it's a really compelling example. Baltimore was made famous for having terrible schools because of The Wire, right? Season 4 really highlighted, and kids weren't going to class, doing drugs, crime, whatever. And so Baltimore 5 years ago got a new superintendent that insisted that as part of his contract, he would have autonomy to do what he wanted. And one of the things he did is he has been very open to charter schools coming into Baltimore and running low-performing schools. But then the other thing that he did is he said every school will be a school of choice and the money within the district will follow the child. And schools that have low performance and low enrollment will be closed. And so he actually looked at the data, and a lot of schools got closed. They turned over 40% of the principals that could not manage their budgets. And so Baltimore today has on almost every indicator higher test scores, higher graduation rates. But some of the most compelling data out of Baltimore is actually not traditional school performance, but data that affects the community. And that is that incarceration for high school students has fallen by 60%. Murder and homicide rates has fallen by 72% for disadvantaged kids that go to those urban city schools in Baltimore. So in some ways, if you were writing the script for The Wire today, many of the things that used to happen to those kids in terms of outcomes, and the primary reason for that is, there are a lot of teachers that are working hard, there's a lot of principals that are working hard, but if those high schools don't keep those kids interested in school, and if they just let them leave, they don't get the money. And that's the fundamental thing that has changed in Baltimore, is if the kids aren't there and the teachers aren't there, there's no money for that individual school.
And let's talk about race and class a little bit more. I mean, you brought up demographics in student bodies. But what about, the proponents of school choice are mainly upper class Republicans and working class blacks, and you don't usually see these groups, in the same room working together.
So, it's interesting. I think more and more we are seeing a lot of kind of bipartisan support. So the Brookings Institute, right, which is a very kind of progressive, kind of traditional liberal think tank, they actually now have started what they call a choice and competition index. And they actually rank every traditional school district in the United States on how much choice and competition that they have. And for them to take such an investment in that kind of an initiative, and so Louisiana, New Orleans actually ranks number 1, and surprisingly New York City ranks second. And they look at things like how many alternatives exist, does the funding follow the child, is there information for the parents to make a correct choice? But so when you have groups like the Brookings Institute that have made one of their fundamental education initiatives measuring choice and competition, you can see how far we've come. And so the Los Angeles School Choice event that just happened here on January 25th, they actually had a group of charter schools and speakers with a lot of kids, and Gloria Romero, who used to be a state senator here in Los Angeles and is a, classic Democrat, she actually runs up Democrats for Education Reform. And you see more and more people that are substantial leaders in the Democratic Party. So whether it's Cory Booker or someone like Gloria Romero, they're coming out for school choice as a civil rights issue. And then I think that's kind of strange bedfellows or a strange coalition with kind of the more people that have always made arguments for choice from kind of an economic perspective or a market, people deserve choice, versus the civil rights issue. And you see these groups working together in positive ways to get bills passed. So for instance, Florida, which has been a hotbed of school choice, Jeb Bush was able to work with the Black Democratic Caucus to get school choice passed in that state. And so you really see that happening more and more across the country. It is these coalitions from both sides of the aisle. Now, does that mean that there's not opposition from the status quo or the unions or the establishment? They still spend a lot of money to oppose these things, but more and more people are speaking out. And the other thing is we have a lot of examples now, like Louisiana or like New York City, of the world doesn't come to an end when we have school choice.
Right, and opponents on the other side might say school choice isn't going far enough. We want complete separation between schools and state. We shouldn't have public schools at all.
So we really have a continuum of school choice. If you think about the ultimate market in education, parents would take full responsibility either through homeschooling or private paying for education. And then on this end, we have traditionally funded 99% of the money goes to public schools, and it's all based on taxpayer money. And so in between that, we have a lot of steps on how close we are to a true free market. And people get pretty upset about where they come down on that continuum. People who like tax credits, they like them better than vouchers because when you get to keep your own money, you have less government entanglement. But we're still at a place where we just are starting to make inroads into competition at the margins. And the fact is we have a single provider and a single payer system. And so in my view, and I think in this kind of bigger tent approach, anything that moves us along to breaking up that education monopoly where the money follows the child is an improvement. And I can understand the risk that we don't want private schools to become heavily regulated. We don't want choices to be diminished because private enterprise starts mimicking government schools. And I think while that is something we have to be vigilant about and is a real caution, if you look at purely private schools today that take no government money, they're still regulated in many, many ways by the government, whether it's how far the swing set can be from the parking lot, health and safety, food safety. They are inspected by all kinds of outside agencies and groups. They're licensed. I mean, it's not as if we have this market already where the government isn't intervening. So we need to work on decentralization versus centralization.
Yeah, and it is worth thinking about this as a battle between centralization and decentralization. I mean, the Obama administration has really been strong on, what did they call it, the Race to the Top initiative, and the Department of Education is pushing for national standards. So is this hurting kids?
Right. So we have what we call now the Common Core initiative, and it's interesting because the Obama administration in some ways comes down on both sides of the fence. They have taken a small portion of the federal education budget, which is several $billions, but still compared to the $150 billion plus, taking $2 billion and saying we'll divide that up amongst states that have innovative proposals, and we'll call it race to the top. You know, while we raise taxes and spending for education overall, far and above that. So, and the Obama administration has been a friend to charter schools. They've started several charter school initiatives. But on the flip side, you know, President Obama would not stand up for the Washington, D.C. voucher program while his own daughters were going to one of the private schools that were part of that D.C. scholarship program. You know, he was never willing, and that was, you know, a few $1 million, a teeny tiny part of the overall that the federal government spends on education. So, you know, overall, the Obama administration has still come down on the side of centralization and inputs. So one of their big initiatives is that we will have a common core set of curriculum for every state, and we'll have basically a set of performance tests that will measure that curriculum for every state. And so what's happened with that is that states like Massachusetts and actually California and Indiana that have higher standards have actually lowered their standards to meet that bar. So in California, we have one of the best math standards in the country, and all 8th graders take algebra earlier than almost anywhere else in the country. And because of that, we actually have seen huge gains in our math scores for low income and regular kids in California. So now we've changed that, and we're not going to do that anymore because of Common Core standards. And so you have these tensions between more centralization and less centralization, and the status quo at the federal level, the state level, certainly buys into more centralization. And, you know, basically the way the Obama administration have gotten states to agree is, I don't know, you remember the No Child Left Behind, which was, you know, George Bush's education initiative. Mm-hmm. It had certain proficiency requirements so that by 2014, 100% of kids were supposed to be proficient in math and reading. Besides the fact that whoever designed that was not a mathematician, and that's statistically really impossible, the bottom line is now, without going through any kind of legislation or congressional approval, but by an administrative waiver process, President Obama's administration has said, if you sign on to Common Core and national tests, we won't hold you responsible for that old initiative. Mm-hmm. So they've never revisited the No Child Left Behind. Legally, it still stands, but they're basically giving every state a waiver. If you do X, Y, and Z, we won't hold you accountable for what was in that previous law. And we won't change the law, we'll just administratively do that.
So just, I mean, wrapping up, would you say, looking to the future in 2013, are you optimistic, or are these other things getting in the way and impeding school choice?
I mean, I think that school choice is winning. I'm very optimistic. I like to say that a lot. And, you know, already this year we've seen several large-scale proposals for school choice. So the governor of Ohio just said that he was going, so Ohio has the Cleveland school choice program, and it has another smaller school choice program for kids stuck in failing schools. The governor has a proposal to make that into a statewide school voucher program that just came out this week. In Tennessee, you have Memphis is actually replicating New Orleans and the Recovery School District, and it seems to be a very robust model where they want to basically make every school a charter school and make the money follow the child from one school to the other. I think we've barely scratched the surface with what technology and the digital revolution is going to mean for, you know, how things like Khan Academy and the popularity of rocket ship education, where they basically have saved on labor costs, where they have used computers and technology for directed lessons for part of the day, and then they have teachers just give lectures. So they basically are saving about 40% of what it costs to run a traditional school in terms of teachers' salaries. You have things like flipped classrooms where the kids actually listen to a lecture on a video at home at night instead of doing homework, and then they do all of their work in the class with the teacher supervising that work. And so all of these interesting models that are just barely starting. And then the other thing, things like homeschooling. Millions more kids can be homeschooled now because of technology, because it's less labor intensive than it used to be. And there's all these kind of open source resources. And then the other thing is, even though there's a lot of resistance in the establishment, I think one of the most positive signs that things are changing is that all kinds of districts are changing their teacher contract to allow for more autonomous schools, getting rid of tenure, getting rid of seniority. You know, you never would have heard of a district voluntarily negotiating for less rules and less security without the pressure and competition from charter schools and other kinds of choice. And
Great.
so, you know, there's a district in Arizona called Vail, and they actually, the whole district has no textbooks. It's all online. They use PowerPoints and the teachers collaborate. And for 5 years, it's been the highest scoring traditional school district in Arizona, and it's really blowing away the competition. And public administrators wouldn't experiment with things like that if they weren't feeling market pressure from everywhere. So it's a great time to be a parent. It's a great time for kids, because I think more and more you have just really a lot of choices available.
Great. Well, I'm going to cut you off there, but thank you again for talking to us, Lisa Snell.
Thanks so much, Tracy.
And thank you for watching Reason TV's first live stream interview. So keep checking Reason.com and Reason TV for upcoming events and new videos. For Reason TV, I'm Tracy Oppenheimer.